5, 10, 15 years ago, for the most part, you could rely on global trade. And if you needed a metal, China would happily supply it and you'd buy it off them and it would land when you need it and you could make the things that you needed. But that is not the case anymore. The global tungsten market is incredibly tight right now, as you can imagine, on the back of these restrictions and bans out of China. When, just sort of very simply put, when the country that mines and supplies 86% of total global supply says we're not going to export any of that outside of our country anymore, you can imagine how tight the market gets.
Today's guest is a supporting sponsor of Liberty in Finance. Welcome back to Liberty in Finance. We're delighted to have this returning guest. Oliver Friesen is the CEO of Guardian Metal Resources. We've had him on a couple of times before around the Ruhl Symposium on Natural Resource Investing in Boca Raton, Florida, talking about tungsten as a strategic material and why it's so important right now. Oliver, thank you for coming on this Friday, April 4th, 2025.
Yeah, great. Thanks for having me again, Dunagun. Looking forward to catching up.
It's been an interesting progression of events that have led to, it seems like, from almost no attention being paid to strategically important materials to almost like a laser beam coming in from many directions and focusing on them. Certainly in the news, we've had Trump talking about the need for U.S. to establish mineral rights in, for example, Greenland, for other materials, not tungsten there. But can you talk to us about why tungsten is so important and vital to the future of industrialized worlds and militarily and for energy, et cetera?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's really interesting that, again, since we spoke last and since the new administration came into power January 20th, it almost feels as though we're hearing about critical metals every day, or at least every week. So certainly I think it's a topic that is now starting to reach a lot of more generalist investors, and they're probably wondering, why are we hearing about critical metals so often? What are they and why do they matter? And I think a big part of that is, as we're seeing today, as this sort of global trade war continues to sort of motor on, it has become abundantly clear that, the U.S. as the kind of global superpower needs safe domestic sources of a whole list of critical metals. Because if you don't have those metals, those key inputs, then a lot of these high important technologies and defense and you name it, they can't operate. They can't manufacture the things that they need. And kind of where I'm going with this is tungsten is a metal where China, for many, many decades, has controlled total global supply. And right now, as we speak, it's about 86% of total global supply comes from China. And if you look down the list of other major producers of tungsten, you have North Korea and Russia also in the top 5. So taking those 3 countries combined, you're at almost 90% of total global mine supply of tungsten coming from those countries. And the important kind of data point to add on top of that is the fact that the U.S. has 0 domestic mine supply. So it's a net importer of that metal. And obviously right now, I would say probably now more than ever, or at least in multiple decades, has the importance of having safe domestic sources of these metals become so important. It's probably as critical as it's ever been, because what we're seeing now is, number one, there's now, I believe, 45% tariffs on any Chinese tungsten imports into the U.S. But probably much more important than that is the fact that as of February 4th, China announced restrictions, and what I'm hearing now is effectively a full ban of all tungsten exports from China to the U.S. plus everyone else in the world. So we're seeing now, and if your listeners are familiar with the antimony story, that's exactly what happened in antimony, over a year ago, was China announced an actual outright export ban of that metal, and the price of that metal has gone up materially, and there's obviously been a huge push for, supporting domestic U.S.-based projects to try to have this metal mined on U.S. soil. So now we're seeing the exact same things happen in tungsten. The market is incredibly tight. And probably the most important thing is we at Guardian Metal Resources have positioned ourselves as the leader in U.S. focused tungsten exploration and development. So tungsten is important because of all these sort of trade factors I mentioned. But the reason why it's so important and critical is the fact that it's a key input metal for the defense sector. And in particular, if you want to produce munitions, then there's a long list of different munitions that require tungsten because it's very high melting point metal and it's also incredibly dense. So if you don't have access to tungsten, the U.S. military, when it wants to build munitions, tank armors, it's used in fighter jets. That's just a small portion. It's also used in nuclear fusion and solar and wind and data centers, you name it. But right now, more than ever, the U.S. needs a domestic mine source, and us at Guardian as the leader are trying to push forward our projects in the U.S. as quickly as we can to provide a safe domestic source of that metal for the U.S. military, but also all the other industries that require this very important metal.
It's interesting how suddenly this coalition of attention is being brought to strategic metals, rare earths, etc. It's almost as though for the last 4 decades or so, this whole global offshoring, outsourcing, just in time, this assumption was made that we lived in an environment where we could have global supply chains and it didn't matter where production happened. As long as you could get something there on a container ship, it would show up eventually and you'd time it just right and everything would work out just fine. And suddenly, first of all, during the COVID lockdowns, when the supply chains, the global supply chains were just badly fractured and all the ports and everything were messed up and ships weren't showing up, stacking up outside harbors, etc. And then also now with tensions around Ukraine and BRICS and everything, and now the Panama Canal is coming. It seems like the rethinking of this benign, elastic environment where you can have stuff come from anywhere and it'll just show up when you need it is all being thrown into question. And suddenly it's as though our countries are waking up from sleepwalking and think, oh my gosh, we've got to have a tied down supply. Whereas, of course, China's been, laser focused on tying down strategic partnerships and jurisdictional cooperative agreements and things all along the way. What about so you're talking about striking while the iron is hot here and trying to move forward while the winds are in your sail. How does executive orders help to accelerate the permitting process when there's this awareness of strategic interest of the United States?
Yeah, and just to touch on the first point you made there, I mean, you nailed it, which is, 5, 10, 15 years ago, for the most part, you could rely on global trade. And if you needed a metal, China would happily supply it and you'd buy it off them and it would land when you need it and you could make the things that you needed. But that is not the case anymore. That is absolutely not the case anymore. We're seeing very restrictive export policies coming out of China now. The global tungsten market is incredibly tight right now, as you can imagine, on the back of these restrictions and bans out of China. When, just sort of very simply put, when the country that mines and supplies 86% of total global supply says, we're not going to export any of that outside of our country anymore, you can imagine how tight the market gets. But yeah, so how does that affect us? I mean, I've mentioned our position in the U.S. So just as a quick kind of outline of what we're doing. So we are Guardian Metal Resources, and we own 2 significant tungsten deposits located in the very mining-friendly state of Nevada. One of those assets hosts the largest undeveloped tungsten deposit in the U.S., and the other deposit or project we own was formerly the largest operating tungsten mine in North America in the 1980s. So 2 significant deposits in Nevada, trying to push those projects forward as quickly as possible, because if the U.S. has a domestic mine source of tungsten, which we can provide from our 2 projects, obviously the trade war is still going to affect a lot of other metals and inputs and things like that. But effectively, we can help be a huge part of the solution for tungsten, because if you have 2 operating mines in Nevada producing tungsten for U.S. industry, that really is a big part of the solution. So what are we seeing now? As I mentioned, just the fact that the new administration is talking about critical metals and tungsten explicitly over the last, it's about 2 months since the new president took office. I think it's important because it's shedding a light on how important these critical metals are and the fact that we can't rely on countries like China or Russia or North Korea for these inputs anymore. So that's an important part of what we're seeing, just sort of the general exposure. But more importantly is what is actually happening and how are things changing to support companies like Guardian. And you mentioned executive orders. We've seen, I think, about 3 now, which are very targeted at domestic production of critical and defense metals. And in particular, one that came out about 2 weeks ago was very hyper-focused on speeding projects on U.S. soil up and also directing and redirecting federal funds to these projects. Because, we need domestic tungsten now, not 10 years from now. So the government is really now kind of stepping up and looking at ways to support companies like Guardian Metal. And it's so important because, these tailwinds 4 or 5 years ago, even 2 years ago, didn't exist. And as you know, in this industry, Dunagun, it's all about timing, right? It's all about how these tailwinds can all come together at the right time to support important projects and companies like ours. So we're kind of waiting for a bit more detail on how this all plays out. But we're hearing how the new administration is very much pushing permitting reform, almost you could call it, which is, hey, we've made it very difficult to permit and get projects into production on U.S. soil. How can we streamline that process? And our company, as we have 2 projects that are going through those processes now, can be very beneficial for us, but also the need to allocate federal funds to these projects as well. Because if we can tap into non-dilutive funding through the U.S. government, it means we can just focus on moving really, really fast. So it's still early days here. I mean, it's all kind of shaking out now, and there's a lot of moving parts right now, but we think we're positioned really, really well. The tungsten market is incredibly tight. It's been one of the kind of the focal metals as this trade war has unfolded. And obviously with everything going on with the tariffs and all the announcements over the last few days, it's become even more important that companies like Guardian, especially on the tungsten front, we push forward and just crack on with getting these projects as close to production and into production as quickly as we possibly can, and looking at tapping into government resources and tailwinds to help us get there as efficiently and time effectively as possible.
Turning to the potential investment opportunities for prospective investors as they look at companies in the development, junior mining and development exploration sector, all of these subsectors of natural resources. It's been unloved for some time now. Rick Rule, whom we have on here monthly, invited Guardian Metal Resources to the Rule Symposium last year, and you guys are hand selected by him. The attendees there don't just get to show up. They have to be selected by him because he's done exceptional levels of diligence and scrutiny to make sure that he wants to own them and thinks that people in managed accounts should as well. What is it that you believe has been causing the whole sector to be so unloved, and do you see that changing now? Is this a turning of the tide that prospective investors should be waking up to if they want to get in before it's obvious to the ordinary people?
Yeah, I mean, there's probably lots of factors there, and people better to speak on that than myself. But the way I see it is, the last call it 4 or 5, maybe 6, 7 years, there's been a lot of easy money in the system. There's been a lot of investors who've gone, oh, well, I can put money in Bitcoin and make 10-20%, whatever it is in the time frame that they're looking to invest. So there's been a lot of easy money made in the system, and now I think that has come to a grinding halt. So investors who were sort of looking for higher risk investments that were typically delivering, that has seemed to change, and the tides are changing now. And really, junior mining has been sort of a risk-on investment thesis. So we're seeing now, I think, a rotation from what's been really easy money in the system to investors having to do a lot more sort of hard work and figure out what they want to invest in. So we're seeing a rotation now, I think, just in the last few months alone. And it's great to see because, it's been an unloved sector, absolutely. But it's now, I think, become so abundantly clear to the more generalist investor, I would say, especially when they're hearing about critical metals almost every week from mainstream media, is that these metals really matter. And more importantly, it is incredibly critical for U.S. national security, for economic prosperity, for general excellence of the country to have domestic sources of these metals. So we're seeing the rotation now. Tungsten is in our view one of the more critical metals right now because of those export restrictions and bans out of China, because of the need of that metal in the defense sector, along with a lot of other really important developing and sort of high-tech technologies like nuclear fusion, and like I said, data centers and solar, wind. I mean, there's a tungsten component to pretty much all those different industries. So the U.S. has no domestic mine production. They rely on, or have formerly relied on, China for the majority of their imports, and now they can't. So a lot of eyes are turning to companies like, Perpetual Resources is a good example in the antimony space, and we've seen them perform exceptionally well. MP Materials is a good example on the rare earth side. These are two companies with projects in the U.S. focused on key input defense metals for national security. And once again, tungsten is in that same boat. It's needed for U.S. defense, national security, a lot of other important industries. So we position ourselves as the leader in U.S. tungsten. And now we're starting to see a lot more interest from mainstream media and U.S. retail and institutional investors say, hey, we've seen what has happened in the rare earth and antimony space and what the underlying equities have done. You're the de facto leader in U.S. tungsten, and we're seeing the same sort of story start to unfold. Just in terms of how I reference it also, antimony has had an export ban in effect for, I think, over a year now. The price has gone up over 4x. The underlying equities have performed exceptionally well. The antimony space might be in the 6th or 7th inning. I think there's still a lot of room to grow there in the antimony space. But tungsten, we just got the export restriction announcement out of China February 4th. So we're only 1 month out right now. So we're sort of in the first inning here in the tungsten space, but we've seen the ball game play out in antimony and rare earths. So we're positioned really perfectly here, and we're excited to see how this unfolds. But our job and our main mandate is to be a big part of the solution for U.S. domestic tungsten. So we're focused on just pushing those projects forward as quickly as we can.
You've talked about the overall environment, why tungsten's important. You've talked about the political environment, geopolitical environment with permitting reform, et cetera. And you've talked about timing of the unloved natural resources sector starting to bring attention because the opportunities aren't as widespread as they used to be, and eyes are starting to focus there. But what about Guardian Metal Resources itself? What differentiates it? You've already talked a couple of things pointed there about the U.S. domestic locations. That's very important. Anything else that people need to be aware of about what differentiates Guardian Metal Resources from your competition in the tungsten space as potential investors look at it?
Yeah, I mean, I think what differentiates us is our position in the U.S. There's a few other, obviously China dominates the market, but there's a few other tungsten, North American traded tungsten companies out there, but their projects are not in the U.S. Their projects in South Korea, Canada, Australia. And I think right now what we're seeing is a huge impetus on mined in America, made in America above anything else. So if you care about mines in America tungsten, that's why we are positioned differently than every other company. This didn't happen overnight. We didn't just hop on the tungsten kind of bandwagon and say, hey, we're the tungsten company. We acquired Pilot Mountain, which is believed to host the largest tungsten deposit in the U.S. over 4 years ago. Before anyone was talking about tungsten, we took a contrarian view. We understood that China dominated the market. We understand how important that metal was for defense and a lot of other sectors. And we bought that asset 100%. We've been pushing it forward. And now it's been a lot of hard work and a lot of hard yards trying to get people to care, but now they're really starting to care. So what sets us apart is we are focused on mines in America tungsten. And there's very few other companies who can say the same thing. And once again, because we positioned ourselves 4 years ago, we've been able to acquire the key assets in the US, but also establish key relationships, including an offtake that we have, LOI offtake, with a company called Global Tungsten and Powders, which is the largest tungsten processing company outside of China. So we've really firmly established ourselves as the de facto leader in U.S. tungsten. And now as people wake up to what's happening here in the tungsten space and seeing the similarities between this and rare earths and antimony, going, hey, this is a company that's actually really interested and they've done a good job to position themselves. And we're seeing kind of all the stars aligning, which once again, as I mentioned, timing and kind of how all these things come together is so important in this space. So we found ourselves exploring for the right metal, tungsten, at the right time during a global trade war, at the right place in the US, and more importantly, in Nevada, which is one of the best places in the entire world to explore, develop, and mine for these metals.
And that was the next question you mentioned about your downstream partner, your off-taking partner, because that's one of the Achilles heels of some strategic materials, some rare earth metals, is that all the smelting is still done in China anyway. So that's reassuring to prospective investors to know that you've got some market already lined up for output that you would start producing. Is any more comments from you about that? And if not, then I wanted to find you, if you could talk to us about any target timeline that you have in your planning towards from going from exploration development into production.
Yeah, you nailed it there. And I think that's another reason why the tungsten space is differentiated from a lot of these other key rare and defense metals, is the fact that the downstream capacity exists in the US. So like you mentioned, even if you mine rare earths or you mine antimony in the US, one of the challenges is to actually take that concentrate and turn it into usable products for the military or for any other industries. A lot of that material, and in some cases all of it, has to go to China because all the refining capacity exists there and none exists in the US. So the reason tungsten is so different is that we can actually mine a tungsten concentrate on US soil from our projects once they're in production. That concentrate can then get moved from our sites in Nevada to our LOI offtake partners, GTP. They have what's called an APT plant in Towanda, Pennsylvania. And there they can actually, there's a chemical process to turn that concentrate into usable tungsten products, tungsten carbides, tungsten oxides, APT, the downstream products, which then can be used to convert into things needed for the military, like munitions and tank armors and you name it. So that's very different. And that means that there's a fully circular supply chain that can exist for tungsten, and it never has to leave US soil as long as we have a domestic mine source, which is what we are focused on at Guardian Metal. So when it comes to timelines, as I mentioned, our goal is to push these projects forward as quickly as we can. We're in a position where we believe both of our projects can be in production before Trump leaves office. But in terms of getting to production even quicker, we've acquired another project recently called Tempayu, which, as I mentioned, was the largest tungsten mine in the 1980s. And the reason that project is of interest is because, number one, there's existing infrastructure on site. So we have, the mill site, we have the substation, we have a concentrate loadout base. Everything has been evaluated by the engineers. It's in good shape. We can reuse it for future development. But also that project is located on what is called patented or private mining claims, which means the amount of permitting you need to do to get into production is a lot less than if you're on federal lands. So that project means that we can move forward very quickly because of the infrastructure and the type of claims that are there. The other thing just to note there, and we're just doing the work on this now, so we need to kind of prove this up, but there's existing stockpiles from the 1980s mine that were not processed. So we're looking at evaluating how much material is there, the grades of that material. But our goal is to find a way to get producing tungsten units in the US as quickly as we can. So we're going through the normal permitting process for the main commercial operations at both of these projects, but then looking at other opportunities with it at Tempayu. And there's also tailings there as well, which we're doing some work on to say, hey, we could actually potentially start producing tungsten units sooner. And this is the timeline. So there'll be more information about that out in the coming weeks and months. But we're looking to produce units as quickly as we possibly can. We have a whole team of engineers looking at exactly that right now.
Well, this has been too long since we've had you back on. It's coming up on, well, I guess it's 9 months or so, and we're going to have you sooner, it sounds like, because it's likely that you'll have some news sooner than that that will be of interest to our viewers and subscribers and potential investors. If people want to find out more right now about Guardian Metal Resources, where should they go?
Yeah, absolutely. So go to our website, guardianmetalresources.com. On Twitter as well, we're very active. Guardian Met Res is there. And then also my personal Twitter is on there. So if you go there, you can probably find myself as well. All we do is tweet about tungsten. And what I think as a closing remark, it's important just to, obviously there's some chaos in the markets right now. Everything is kind of being taken down right now. But at the end of the day, I think this really will push people ultimately, once the dust settles, to Mined in America and Made in America companies. And as a reminder, we are focused on Mined in America tungsten. And if you have Mined in America tungsten, the tariffs, the export restrictions, those go away, because that's what these tariffs are sort of meant to do. Or part of it is to support American competitiveness again. So we're obviously, it's a bit chaotic right now, but at the end of the day, I think we'll see, the recognition that the need for domestic mined tungsten is probably as great as it's ever been. And therefore, companies like Guardian Metal Resources have positioned themselves perfectly for what's to come here.
Well, Oliver, it's great to see you again. It's great to hear more of the progress that's been made at Guardian Metal Resources. Folks, we'll put links to their website of Guardian Metal Resources in the description of this video, so you can have a quick landing to jump to their homepage. And Oliver, just thank you again for joining us again here on Liberty and Finance, and looking forward to our next chat soon.
Let's do it, Dunagun. And there's lots going on, so I'm sure we'll be chatting sooner rather than later this time.